Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make this happy for you. Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make this happy for you.
Okay, hello. Good evening. Time for another Star Wars reading. It's been a little bit. I think we skipped one. We did the short story on Wednesday, but we missed the Monday reading. So this is what should have been read Monday. We'll be finishing up this book. It's only 4 chapters. It's another novella. In this Lost Tribe of the Sith series. So, anyway, yeah, we'll just jump right on into it. Chapter 3. The Sith were about glorification of self and the subjugation of others. That much made sense as the young Sela saw life in Ludo Kresh's palace. What did not make sense was why so many of her people, in her own family, embraced the Sith teachings when they had no hope of advancement. Why would a Sith live as a slave? It wasn't that way for everyone. In the grand scheme, the Sith Empire had been at rest for many years, but an empire of Sith is an empire of small schemes. From Kresh's command, newly adult Sela had watched her master rage at the ventures of Naga Sato. She had seen Sato at several meetings in Kresh's company, almost all of them ending in fury. The two leaders differed on everything. Long before the discovery of a space lane into the heart of the Republic set them at odds over the future direction of the Sith Empire. Sato was a visionary. He knew permanent isolation was a practical impossibility in an empire comprising so many systems and so many potential hyperspace routes. The Stygian caldera was a veil, not a wall, and he could see opportunity through it. And in Sato's entourage, Sela had seen many humans and members of other species with apparent status. She even met Corson's captain father once. For Sato, contact with the new was a thing to be desired, and outsiders could be as Sith as any born in the Empire. For Kresh, who spent his days in battle and his nights toiling on a magical device to protect his young son from all harm, there could not be a worse fate than escape from the Sith's cosmic cradle. "Do you know why I do this?" Kresh had asked one night. His drunken rage had touched the entire household, Sela included. "I have seen the holocrons. I know what waits beyond. My son looks like me, and so does the future of the Sith. But only as long as we're here. Out there," he spat between bloody punches, "out there the future looks like you." Adari Vol had once told Corson that the Kashiri did not have a number large enough to describe their own population. The Omen crew had tried to make estimates in their initial years on Kesh, only to find even more villages over the horizon. Tetzabal, at 18,000 Kashiri residents, had been one of the last cities counted before the Sith finally gave up. Now they had given up again. The walls of Tetzabal were filled with corpses, making a body count impossible. As they arrived on Uvak that night, Sela, Corson, and their companions could see them all from the sky, littering the dirt roads like branches after a storm. Some had collapsed within the doorways of their Hejarbo shoot huts. It was the same inside, they soon saw. What they didn't see were survivors. If any existed, they were hiding well. 18,000 bodies was a good guess. Whatever happened had happened suddenly. A nursing woman had fallen, locked together with her infant in a fatal embrace. Troughs laced through the streets, fed from the aqueduct. Several Kashiri had fallen in and drowned right beside their floating wooden pails. Alive and alone, here stood Ravelin, rattled and clinging inside the still-locked city gate. He had held his position in Tetzabal throughout the evening, looking much the worse for it. Corson approached him as soon as he mounted. "It started after I met with my new contacts here," Ravelin said. "People started collapsing in restaurants, in the markets, then the panic began." "And where were you during all of this?" Ravelin pointed to the town circle, a plaza with a large sundial much like the one in Tav. It was the tallest structure in the city, apart from the Uvak-driven pulley system that fed the aqueduct. "I couldn't find the aid I'd brought with me. I leapt up there to call for her and to survey what was going on." "Surveying?" Sela snarled. "Really?" Ravelin exhaled angrily. "Yes, I was trying to get clear. Who knows what plague these people might be carrying? I was up there for hours, watching people drop. I called for my Uvak, but it was dead too." "Tether ours outside the walls," Corson ordered. He looked flustered in the torchlight. He pulled a cloth from his tunic and placed it over his mouth, not seeming to realize he was the last in the party to do so. He looked at Sela. "Biological agent?" I can't say," she said. Her work had been with the Sith, never the Kashiri, who knew what they might be susceptible to. Corson tugged at Gloyd. "My daughter's in Tav. Make sure she gets back to the mountain," he said. "Go." The Hook, uncharacteristically shaken, bolted for his mount. "It could be airborne," Sela said, walking dazed through the corpses. "That would explain how it had hit so many so quickly, but we haven't been affected." A cry came from up ahead. There, Sela saw what their scout had found beneath another body, Ravelin's missing assistant. The woman was in her 40s, like Sela, human and dead. Sela clutched the gauze over her face. Fool, I'm a fool. Is it already too late?" "It's late enough," Ravelin said, catching her unguarded thought. He confronted Corson. "You know what you have to do." Corson spoke in a monotone. "We'll burn the city, of course. We'll burn it." "It's not enough, Commander. We have to shut them out." "Shut who out?" Sela snapped. "The Kashiri," Ravelin gestured to the bodies around them. "There's something killing them, and it can kill us. We've got to remove them from our lives once and for all." Corson looked completely taken aback. Sela grabbed his shoulder. Don't listen to this. How will we live without them? Like Sith, Ravelin explained. This is not our way, Sela. We have become too dependent upon these creatures. They are not Sith. Neither are we, by your people's lights. Don't get political, Ravelin said. Look around, Sela. Whatever this is should have killed us by now. If it hasn't, we shouldn't take it for what it is. This is a warning from the dark side. Behind the cloth, Sela's jaw dropped. Corson snapped back to reality. Wait, he said, taking Ravelin's arm. Let's talk about this. Corson and Ravelin began walking toward the gate, which even now was being opened by their attendants. The village itself seemed to exhale wretched air passing through the opening. Sela didn't move, spellbound by the bodies around her. The dead Kashiri looked all the same to her, purple faces and blue tongues, faces twisting in choking agony. Her foot faltered, and she saw Ravelin's assistant. What was her name? Ilyana? Sela had known the woman's whole family tree the day before. Why couldn't she remember her name now, when the woman was on the ground, choked on her tongue, bloated and blue? Sela stopped. She knelt beside the corpse, careful not to touch it. She drew her shikar, the glass blade the Kashiri had fashioned for her, and carefully worked open the woman's mouth. There it was, the tongue, a mad azure, blood vessels engorged and bursting. She'd seen it before in humans, at the edge of her memory. I need to go back, Sela said, erupting from the village gates. I need to go back home to the ward. Corson, directing his henchmen building a bonfire, looked puzzled. Sela, forget about any survivors. We're the survivors, we hope. Ravelin, lucklessly trying to calm the collected Uvak Corson had tethered outside the village wall, looked back in alarm. If you think of bringing this disease into our sanctum... No, she said. I'm going alone. If we here are infected, nothing matters anyway. She took the bridle of an Uvak from Ravelin and flashed him an unenthusiastic smile. But if we're not infected, it's like you said. It's a warning. Corson watched her leave and turned to the task of burning the village. Sela didn't look back, soaring into the night. There wasn't much time. She'd need to meet with her entire staff at the ward, her most loyal aides. And she'd need to see her son. When dawn broke over the Takara Mountains, Sela was not found in the shower by Tilden Ka. As much as she now felt like she needed one, Sela hadn't slept at all. With Corson and Ravelin's return in the dead of night, the retreat had become a crisis center. Communications were the real problem. The deaths of nameless Kashiri had stirred the force little for those who didn't care about them anyway, but the aftermath had stirred some confusion in the minds of the Sith that even the most experienced heralds were having trouble fielding messages. Corson had been careful in calling for the return of his people from the Kashiri towns and villages. So far, Tav and the rest of the major cities had not heard of the disaster in Tetzebol, and he didn't want a mass withdrawal putting the natives on their guard. Sith abroad were instructed to casually remove themselves from public contact and make their way home. What had befallen Tetzebol had not yet struck the major cities, but reconnaissance flyers were still out, checking on the surrounding areas. By the time word came in from the hinterlands, all of the Sith would be safely in their redoubt. Sela saw Corson several times in the morning as she passed through. He wanted her staff to set up quarantines for re-entry to the compound. None of the Sith who had torched Tetzebol were showing any symptoms of distress, but the stakes were high. Sela had assignments of her own in the ward, and in fact, few of her medical staffers appeared in public. We're working on the problem, she had told him. Re-entering at noon, Sela saw Ravelin standing with Corson, monitoring reports. Corson seemed haggard from lack of sleep. His little purple fluff wouldn't be coming for lunch today, But Ravelin, despite his harrowing experiences of the day before, seemed rejuvenated. His bald head was a robust magenta. "It goes better than we feared, Corson," Ravelin said. "No Grand Lord now," Sela noticed. "Not even Commander." Corson grunted. "All your people are back?" "I am informed they have all just arrived at the stables. Not much of a vacation," Ravelin said, his facial tendrils curling slightly. "But then there is much work to be done on our new priorities." Sela looked up. "It should be about now." "Rider coming!" The herald sensed the Uvak's approach long before it appeared on the southern horizon. Waved directly onto the colonnade, the rider set the beast down and leapt to the stone surface. All eyes were on the new arrival, all save Sela's. "Grand Lord," he said, short of breath, "it has happened again, in Rabelo." Sela heard Corson's gasp, but she saw Ravelin's yellow eyes bulge. It took but a second for the quartermaster to find his composure. "Rabelo? That's on the Ragnos Lakes, isn't it?" Sela looked toward Ravelin and smiled primly. "That's where your people were assigned to go yesterday, wasn't it, Ravelin? Villages on the Ragnos Lakes?" He nodded. They'd all been there when it was being discussed. Ravelin cleared his throat, suddenly dry. I should speak then with my associate, who just returned from there." He hobbled past Sela, turned and bowed. I really should meet them, Commander." "You do that," Sela said. Corson said nothing, still flabbergasted by the recent news and the coincidence. He watched Ravelin disappear from sight, heading for the stables. "Rider coming!" Corson looked up. Sela thought he almost looked afraid of the news the rider would bring. The news was of another city of death, on another of the Ragnos Lakes. A third rider told of a third, and a fourth. 100,000 Kashiri dead. Corson goggled. Something to do with the lakes? That was it. Algae of... That was it. What was it? Algae of Ravelin's? Sela crossed her arms and looked directly at Corson, stooped over and nearly her same height. She was tempted to let the moment linger, but there was work to be done. She called for Tilden Ka. Her worried assistant appeared from the direction of the ward, holding a small container. She took it and dismissed him. "Do you know what this is, Corson?" Corson turned the empty vial over in his hand. "Cyanogen silicate." It was from her medical stores on Omen, and also from the stores Ravelin kept for the creatures in his care. In its solid form, she explained, it was used as a cauterizing agent by healers working with the Massassi. She had seen it used again and again in Ludo Kresh's service. Nothing weaker could do anything to those savages' hides. "It's bad enough on its own," she said, "but if moisture gets into it, it breaks down and intensifies 1,000-fold. 1 particle per billion could do anything." Corson's bushy eyebrows flared. What could it do in the water table, or an aqueduct? Sela held his hands firmly and looked directly into his eyes. Tetzebal. She explained the story behind the death of her ward's bearer. Beefy Gorham had been seconded to Ravelin's team to help reach what remained in crushed sections of Omen. He'd apparently touched a stained deck plate from the Massassi apothecary and died outside not long after washing his hands. Death was not instantaneous, but the victim never got far. Ravelin must have seen Gorham's death, she said, and realized he had a tool against the Kashiri, a weapon that could force Corson and the rest of the humans to forget about building on this world and recommit to leaving it. And now every city that members of the 57 had visited in the previous day had gone the same way as Tetzebal. Corson spun and shattered his bridge chair against a marble column. He didn't use the force. He didn't need to. "Why would they do this?" He grabbed Sela. "Why would they do this when it's so obvious I'd trace it back to them? How stupid, how desperate would they have to be?" "Yes," Sela said, curling around him. How desperate would they have to be? Corson looked into the sun, now beating down on the mountain. Releasing her, he looked into the faces of his other advisors, all waiting and wondering. "Bring all the others," he said. "Tell them it's time." Chapter 4. Sip. Seal had already set her mind on leaving Ludo Kresh before he executed her family. It was trivial. His ankle had been injured in a battle, and she had failed to stop the infection. He'd killed her father the first night, and his leverage lessened considerably after that. Sela found her chance to go a few days later when one of Sato's mining teams stopped on Relg to refuel. She didn't have anybody left by then anyway. Devore Corson had been her escape. She saw his immaturity and recklessness, but she also saw something there to work with. He, too, strained against the invisible chains limiting his ambition. He could be her ally, and in Sato's service at least something could happen, as long as Devore didn't foul it up. And if he did, well, there was always their son. Lightsabers flashed in the night on the mountain, but not on the main plaza. Sela walked calmly along the darkened colonnade, now festooned with added decorations, the tentacled heads of the 57 staked at even intervals. There was the young sentry from the tower, trapped and killed. He'd never abandoned his post. To the right was Hestus, the translator. Sela had been involved personally in his takedown. Corson said they'd come back to Hestus in the morning to remove the cybernetic implants. Who knew, there might be something they could use there. She could sense Corson and his chief lieutenants beyond the outer wall now, driving the remnant to a last stand beside the precipice where Omen nearly met its end. No quarter would be offered. She would see Corson hurling any who surrendered over the side. Well, he has experience with that. The stone silo of the stable master loomed before her. Uvok enclosures stretched out in all directions from this central hub, where Kashiri aides would wash the stinking beasts. The Kashiri were gone tonight, she saw as she entered the round room. At the center, watched only by a guard in the shadows, hung the limp but breathing body of Ravelin. Strong cords of Kashiri woven fiber lashed his splayed arms to cornices high on either side of the structure. The arrangement was designed to keep Uvok from bolting during their baths. Now it was doing the same for Ravelin, his feet dangling mere centimeters above the ground. Sela stepped back as a rush of water poured through from slots high in the tower, gagging the prisoner. The flow stopped after a minute, but was longer before the weary Ravelin registered the presence of his visitor. "All gone," he choked. "Right?" "All gone," she said, stepping into his sight. "You were the last." Ravelin had been caught early, his bad leg failing him once and for all. Ravelin shook his head. "We only did it one time." He said, his throat a gravelly trail. Yeah. "In Testibal. These other cities, I don't know. We never planned—" "For me?" Sela said. It had been surprisingly easy, once she'd realized Ravelin's ploy in Testival. The only element was time. She'd returned to the mountain retreat in the night and summoned her most trusted aides from the ward. Soon after midnight, her minions were in the air, propelling their creatures toward the lake towns of the south that Ravelin's people had been instructed to visit the day before. Her ward had held the only other surviving supply of cyanogen silicate. Now it was in the wells and aqueducts of the lake cities, and in the bodies of the dead Kashiri. Time was the key element, but she'd had help coordinating it all. You did this?" Ravelin coughed, and managed a weak chuckle. "I guess that's the first time you liked one of my ideas." It did the job. Ravelin's crumpled grin vanished. "What job? Genocide? You care about the Kashiri now?" "You know what I mean." Ravelin strained at his bonds. "My people." Sela rolled her eyes. Nothing's going on here that wouldn't have happened in the Empire eventually. You know how things were going. Whose movement were you in anyway? Naga Sato didn't want this, Ravelin rasped. Sato valued power where he saw it. He valued the old and the new. He valued us. He nodded to the guard, and she nodded to the guard, and another crushing barrage of water slammed Ravelin. It took longer for him to recover this time. It could have worked, he choked. We could have worked, together, like the Sith and the fallen Jedi of old, if only our children, my children, had lived. Ravelin looked up, water streaming from his sagging face. You... Sela fixed her silent gaze on the chutes, still dripping near the ceiling high above. You, he repeated louder, you ran the creche. You and your people. His face twisted into an agonized scream. The future of his people had already been smothered long before. What did you do? What did you do to us? Nothing you wouldn't eventually have done to us. She stepped toward the shadows near the guard. We are not your Sith. We are something new, a chance to do it right. A new tribe. Younglings, infants, wilted Ravelin moaned. What kind of mother are you? The mother of a people, she said, looking toward the guard in the shadows. Wow, I don't know where that came from. Sorry. Um, the mother of a people, she said, looking toward the guard in the shadows. Now, my son. The guard stepped forward, and Ravelin saw the animal form of Jared Corson coming at him, blade drawn, the wild-eyed face of his father under jet-black hair. The teenager leapt at the prisoner, wielding a jagged vibroblade without remorse. At the last he drew his lightsaber and cut Ravelin down in a violent flash of crimson. You've changed the world today, Sela said, stepping close to her son and confederate. He'd been key to coordinating the previous night's gambit, getting her accomplices where they needed to go. It was right that he should have part in this moment. The boy panted, looking down at his victim. He's not who I want to kill. Be patient, Sela said, stroking his hair. I have been. Tilden Kaw walked quietly along the darkened pathways of Tav, only recently paved with stones. The Sith had dismissed the other Kashiri attendants earlier in the morning, when the excitement began. He had been one of the last to leave. The streets, usually peopled with merrymakers even at this hour, were alarmingly still. He only saw one middle-aged member of the Neshtavar standing station at a crossing. Stripped of his Uvak years before, the figure looked bored. Tilden nodded to the watchman and passed into a plaza near one of the many village aqueducts. Sheets of fresh mountain water tumbled in long crescents from flumes, a cooling presence in what had become a hot night. Arriving before a wall of water, Tilden donned the robe he was carrying, raised the hood, and stepped into the downpour. Or rather through it. Tilden walked dripping down the dark passage leading deep into the stone structure. He followed hushed voices to the end of a passage. There was no light, but there was life. Tilden heard agonized chatter as he approached. The horrible news from the south had begun to arrive. The superstitious Kashiri would probably be expected to absorb the horror quietly, a voice said from the shadows. The destructors would probably be blamed. It is done, Tilden spoke to the darkness. Sela has rid the Skyborn of the 57, of the people not like them. Only the bumpy man Gloyd remains. Sela doesn't suspect you, returned the husky female voice from the darkness. She doesn't read your mind? She doesn't think I'm worth it, and I speak of nothing but the old legends. She thinks me a fool. She can't tell our great scholars from our fools? Said a male voice. None of them can, said another. Good. Let's keep it that way. Sela has done us a favor, reducing their numbers. She may do more. A blinding flash appeared as an old Kashiri man lit a lantern. There were several Kashiri here, huddled in the cramped space. Their attentions not on Tilden, but on the figure stepping from the shadows behind them. Tilden turned to recognize the woman who had first addressed them. "Stay strong, Tilden Ka. With your help, and with the help of all of us here, the Kashiri will finish the job." Anger glistened in Adari Val's eyes. "I brought this plague upon us, and I will end it." And that is the end of this book. So, yeah, these are really short books. So that will end this reading session, and I'll take a break, and then we will, I will come back for Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. I am about to go to the party, which sounds to me like the end of the game, like the final battle, but I don't know. So we'll find out. But yeah, I will be back in a little bit for a new session.
Prepare to die.